So welcome to Introduction to Judaism. This is our first course, our first class session for the course. There's a total of 20 sessions. We're going to be putting it up on the website as a way to let you be able to catch up on something if you missed something. You are more than welcome to break in and ask questions. I'll also allow questions at the end. What we've done is we have this book to get started, which is called The Jewish Holidays. It's a bit dense, if you don't feel like you need to underline every single thing and remember every single item. It's giving you a lot more information than you need. And part of the reason why it's giving you more information than you need is just so that you know it's out there. And then, and also to give you something in case you saw something when you visited or somebody and were like, what was that? The book might be able to help you, or I'll be able to explain. So that's part of the reason why I gave you this book. In the lectures, we're actually just going to go at a much higher bird's eye view than the detailed list that we've got going here. So so don't worry if the reading is like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of information. Yeah, it is. It's fine. Just kind of move through it, and eventually some of the terms will start showing up over and over again, and you'll be comfortable with it. So that's why I was giving you this. Plus, I love that he has little commentaries on the side. These kinds of commentaries on the side I think are lovely, because then they argue with him routinely, and that's really very Jewish and very good to have this idea that you can argue or ask questions or raise other points. So that was part of my point of view when I did this. So let me share screen, my fun project that I've been working on. I'm so happy about. Okay, share. And I'm going to hit play on that so that way you don't see what slide is coming up next. Yes. Is this not fancy? I'm so proud of myself. At any rate, Introduction to Judaism. I have taught this as a college course before. Yay, thank you. And what happens is you're getting actually something very similar to what I do for the college course. So, all right, where we're starting is with Passover, mostly because that's what Michael Strassfeld started with. And also, it's not a bad place to start. Passover is originally the start of the year. And that's why it says in the first month, on the 15th of the month, you will observe Passover in the Bible. And that's also why when we get to Rosh Hashanah, it says in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, you will observe a day of blasts. Originally, the calendar had been reversed, where spring was the new year, and the fall was actually the other pole of the year. So, and as I said, at any point, feel free to stop me with questions. So, okay, I'm going to, I lost my cursor here. So Passover is the Feast of Freedom. What I have here on this is the Passover Haggadah, and hopefully you can see that okay. On my screen, I can't see it quite right. So I'm going to see if I can fix that. Oops, go backwards. Okay, well, the Seder is, what happens with Passover is that we use what's called a Haggadah. The Haggadah is this sort of booklet that tells us the order of the meal that we're going to have. That Haggadah has its origins in the era of the ancient rabbis, which means like about the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. In other words, it's been around for quite a while, but not all the way back into ancient Israelite times. At the time that the temple stood, Passover was observed as a sacrifice of lamb. It was not this elaborate meal. The meal is definitely a later development, and it's definitely the creation of the rabbis. So one of the things we do see sometimes is that churches will think that they're doing what Jesus did. And you're like, no, if you do a Seder, you're not doing what Jesus did. Because if you want, in the times of when the temple stood, when in the life and times that were supposed to have been Jesus's, that would have been the sacrifice of an animal, of a lamb, and a shared meal, not this formal dinner. The Seder has, as I said, the booklet. It's called the Haggadah. Feel free to jump in if you have a question. And the word Seder itself means order. The word refers to the fact that the meal was eaten in a certain order and done in a certain order, has very symbolic meanings. So the families would celebrate together with this large and festive meal. Still happens to this day, like if it's one of those things that if you want to make a map to the dominant Christian culture, the Passover Seder is similar to like a Christmas meal in that it's, even if you observe nothing else in your family, that's the thing you're going to do in home. And if you only go to one service a year, that would, like Easter, then that would be going to either Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And so this is actually one of the most important holidays, and it's the one that has the most family connections and traditions related to it. So your family does it some specific way if you're raised Jewish, and has certain and that varies a lot. It could be very observant, it could be very strict, it could be very loose. You could be like, if I flatten my bread, that counts as not as being fine for Passover. Or it could be like, we are going through with a toothbrush through all of the little crevices in the kitchen to get rid of anything that resembles leavening. But the big event, and that's why I was leading with it, is the Seder. And so the Seder has these symbolic foods associated with it. Each of the foods on the Seder plate has a symbolic meaning. So in the Seder plate, you might recognize this picture. Anybody recognize this picture? Yes? Do you know where it comes from? Yeah, that's from our sanctuary. The one in our sanctuary has the different pieces. So at the very top, you see the zerah, which is the shank bone, and that represents the sacrifices that were offered in the temple. So it's supposed to be like a lamb bone, although the bone itself doesn't have to be a lamb bone. In fact, there are variations on whether or not you would include a lamb bone in your Seder plate. We'll see that in a minute. And what happens is that it can be pretty much any bone. It's often a chicken bone, as long as it's not like, say, a pig bone, because that would be wrong. But like, if you don't know that, if I don't tell you that, you might show up to a Seder having said, yeah, I'll bring the bone, and then you have a ham hock, and that would be bad. So I'm letting you know, it shouldn't be a non-kosher animal. When I say kosher, I mean an animal that has been that is on the list of animals that are allowed to be eaten. So pig is not one of them. And that has also been slaughtered according to the correct way. You'd have to ask your host on whether or not they need that part, but it should at least be one of the animals that's allowed according to the Bible. And in that sentence, I just showed you one of the difficulties in explaining Judaism and doing Introduction to Judaism. It's this idea of, where do you start? Because I have to explain things like kosher in order to explain why you can't put a pig bone on a Seder plate, right? But we're going to, so if I use one of these terms, jump in, say something, okay? Okay. So in the Seder plate, what we have is each of these foods has a symbolic meaning. So you have the zerah, which is the shank bone, which is at the top of the plate. And it doesn't have to be in this order, by the way. And some plates will have on them, mine has written in Hebrew, each of these words. So it was not helpful to me that I got this plate before I could read Hebrew, by the way. So I'd have to look each one up to try to be like, I think that's the right one. Or your plate might have just little spaces and doesn't tell you what goes where. It doesn't matter, actually. It's not like you can get all excited about, I made a Star of David with these different things in this different order, fine. But as long as you got stuff on a plate, you're good. And does it have to be a Seder plate? No, you can use a regular plate and make a Seder plate out of it. So that's the fun part, is that you can do as elaborate or as simple as you wish. So what else belongs in this plate is the charoset, which is a fruit compote. It's usually made with dried fruit and nuts and cinnamon and wine. Those are the most common things. That recipe, by the way, is almost 2,000 years old. The initial Seder, when it's first created, they have charoset as part of what they're going to do. And there's a lot of recipes out there. There's a Sephardi version that uses usually like dried apricots. The Ashkenazi version usually uses apples. The difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi, by the way, Sephardim are the people who come from like Spain, North Africa, parts of the Middle East. And the Ashkenazi Jews are the ones who come from Europe, especially Germany, France, Poland, Lithuania, Russia. And the two groups have separate habits and histories in terms of how, especially showing up at Passover, what they will do. One of their differences is that the Sephardi, the Eastern, folks coming from Morocco and Spain and those places, will use lamb in their Seder and will use a lamb bone. The Ashkenazi will not use lamb in their Seder and will not use a lamb bone. And they do, the interesting thing is they come to opposite decisions on the basis of the same reason. Both of them are saying, because the temple doesn't stand, we are going to use lamb, or we are not going to use lamb. So, because lamb was one of the things that was offered. But one of the other things that's different between them is that for charoset, the fruit compote, what kinds of things would be used and how you would spice it vary according to which group you're with. The Ashkenazi world had a lot more apples in it, so that's why it tends to have apples. Again, you could find a recipe or you could wing it. I wing it every year. I get whatever's in the cupboard. I get some apples, I get some honey, I get some wine, I get some cinnamon, I get some nuts. There's a few nuts I can eat and chop them all up and then make something tasty out of it. But I'm that kind of a cook, right? You also could have it, spend hours on Pinterest going, let's see, I could put cloves in it. I could put, and so forth. Any questions so far? No, everybody seems to be doing all right. Good. Karpas is a green vegetable that is also put up on it. And the karpas is representing spring. So it doesn't have any more greater point than that, but it's representing spring. And one of the things that's often used is parsley, but it could be anything green. Beitza is a roasted egg. That's representing the rebirth of spring and the circular nature of the year. Chazeret, not every Seder plate has this extra thing. Some have 5 spaces, some have 6. This is just whether or not yours has it. So if you take a regular plate and make a Seder plate out of it, chances are you won't do this. But if you have a Seder plate that has chazeret, mine does, you will do this. It's an additional green. It's usually an additional bitter green. So the most common form would be to pick out romaine because it's actually bitter at the base. Right? It's sweet up at the top, but it's bitter at the base. And then finally, maror, which is a bitter herb, which is nearly always horseradish, although it could be something else. As I said, sometimes people use romaine. There's a thing, it could be the horseradish root as a clunk right on the table, like or you could grate it up, or you could get the prepared stuff, or you get the purple prepared stuff. Although if you get the purple prepared stuff, I suggest you drain it a little because it'll bleed all over your plate. Not fun. I learned that the hard way. Not pictured in this particular image is salt water, which represents tears. And so what happens in the Seder is we're going to go through this process of explaining the Exodus from Egypt using these symbolic foods. We'll dip the parsley in salt water to represent the tears and eat it, and to represent the rebirth of spring. We'll take the charoset, which is that sweet stuff, which represents the mortar between the bricks, and we'll mix it with the bitter herb to represent the bitterness of slavery, and we'll make a sandwich of it. That's how I eat my sandwich. And we'll have this together as a way to express our experience of going from the bitterness of slavery to the liberation and the experience of freedom. The Seder, as I said, was created by the ancient rabbis after the fall of the Second Temple, so sometime after the year 70 in Common Era. And many of these practices today date back to those first and second centuries. Some of the things that come from that original Seder that you will see in the Talmud, the work of these ancient rabbis, are the practice of leaning, reclining on your chair, comes from them. The practice of eating matzah, which is the unleavened bread, the practice of making a sandwich out of the bitter herbs and the matzah and the charoset, the practice of dipping your herbs, although not necessarily in salt water, they might have dipped it in other sauces as sort of an hors d'oeuvre. The practice of reciting the story of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, Moses and God and Aaron and Miriam, and the whole process of splitting the sea and leaving. All of these things come to us almost 2,000 years ago, as I said, sometime after the year 70, and they kind of bring it together, similar to what had been a Roman practice of free people laying around and having these symposiums, a word we still use, to talk about things and eat food and have conversations. And so they're like, if you were a free person, you would lean and you would eat and you would recline and you would have the whole day to talk, or the whole evening, because a good Seder will last 6 hours, just so you know, and enjoy this. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Here's some pictures of Seders, and what I love about these, is it shows you some of the different ways that Seders get done. What happens here is in the upper right corner, that's actually an Israeli family. You can tell by the stones behind them, and they're actually singing. What the Seder has a lot of songs that are involved in it. One of the most famous of them is Dayenu, Day Dayenu, Day Dayenu, Day Dayenu, Dayenu, Dayenu. Okay, but there's a lot of songs that are associated specifically with Passover. Many of them are silly, I got to tell you, or just fun. Because the service is actually organized a lot around the children, and is intended to be a way to teach your children about some of the core themes of what it means to be Jewish. But as you also see, like in the bottom picture there, you can tell that they're sitting in their living room. I don't know if you can see that whole thing, but there's a television in the back, and one of those like big entertainment centers that you put a television in. And there's also, you can tell from the tables that they've put like folding tables up together and united them by means of using the same color tablecloth. That's totally normal to have a lot of people, like to be inviting a whole lot of people to your house. It's not uncommon for folks to have 20, 30 people as part of their Seder. The largest Seder I've ever done was in fact 35. So the smallest, by the way, was 2. So it's still totally legit if there's just the 2 of you, but it's really common to be like, let's invite everybody and have a big deal. And you also see there, that's the classic Manischewitz, the little guy with all the curls is trying to pour a glass of the Manischewitz for somebody, hopefully older than him, because he shouldn't be drinking the Manischewitz, it's much too young. And you see that one of the things they've done is actually created this little appetizer of eggs, because though the service, one of the jokes about it is when do we, the fourth question, there's 4 questions. The 5th question is when do we eat? What happens is that you can actually put out food, and it isn't that rigid about if you want to have appetizers and eat all the way through it, that's perfectly fine. So how are we doing? Good, okay. Matzah. Now let's talk matzah. Matzah, as you can see here, is something that we eat throughout the duration of the holiday. The holiday may last 7 days or 8 days. The difference between the two is if you live in the land of Israel, it always lasts 7 days. If you live outside of the land of Israel, we've added extra day of the holiday back in the days when we couldn't intercalculate the year, when we couldn't determine when the holiday ended. And so we would have it be longer just to make sure we'd covered the full amount. So that's where the 8-day idea comes from outside of Israel. They would light fires on the hills and do essentially a form of smoke signals to let people know when the new moon had arrived and when the dates hit. We've since figured that out. So the Reform movement was like, we're just going to do it like Israel because we don't need the extra day. But the rest of the tradition is tradition. And so what's happened is you have in what's called the diaspora, the area outside of Israel, this habit of doing an extra day for each of the holidays. So that's where you get 8 days for Passover. Yes, what's your question?
So what do we do in Reform? Do we observe Passover for 8 days or 7, or is it personal preference? How does it work?
And so the Reform movement formally observes 7 days, but it's not uncommon to have members of the congregation who observe 8. And then it's not uncommon to have Reform congregations that will do the extra day. So this congregation for Rosh Hashanah does a 2nd day. And as a result, because we had it, when it first was formed, it was formed as a sort of a coalition between conservative and Reform Jews. And as a result, we've done 2nd day for everything. What that means is that officially as a congregation, we won't break Passover until the 8th day. So if your oneg falls on the 8th day of Passover, you still, like 7th to the 8th day, you still have to have Passover food. But we don't look askance, or we're not like, if members are observing 7. Me personally, I've always done 7. That's my own. So you get these kinds of interesting phenomenon where I could have broken Passover already, come to an oneg that is still Passover, and fine, that happens.
Thank you.
One of the things that happens with this is that with the Passover Seder, what you have in these pictures, the one on the left is what's called Shmura matzah, which means observe. These big round circles, you pay extra because they're watched from the time that the wheat is first grown all the way until it's harvested and baked, instead of just having the wheat when it is brought in to be made. Because what happens is for it to not be counted as chametz, as something that has fermented, the wheat needs, or whatever the grain is, needs to not come into contact with water more than 18 minutes. And so shmura matzah has been particularly watched. So it's more expensive. Regular matzah is fine. Get the shmura if you like the look of it and the taste of it, but regular matzah is fine. Like you don't need to be that stringent. But here we have several different kinds. Actually, matzah used to be circular, and the square ones is a modern invention. They didn't used to be square. They are square because they fit nicely in boxes if you manufacture them. That's the Manischewitz company. That's the one who actually had to ask a question of a rabbi to find out if a square matzah is still kosher. And that's how we end up. And now everybody thinks it's always square. Isn't that funny? So that's where it comes from. What also happens with the matzah is that you break the matzah as part of the Seder you have 3 matzahs that are separated out that represent the Levites and the Kohanim and Israel. And you break the middle matzah, and that middle matzah, part of it is taken and used. You can see on the left side, they're breaking the matzah for this as what's called the afikomen. The afikomen is this idea that you hide a piece of this matzah somewhere in the building, somewhere that usually the kids can find it. And before you finish your Seder, you have to redeem the afikomen by giving whoever found it a prize, and they give it back to you. And then you can finish the Seder. So this is sort of a way to play with the kids and keep them entertained and keep them engaged all the way through. The only downside is that having hit it, you're supposed to then eat it. So, you want to maybe wrap it in a napkin or something so that you don't end up eating matzah that has been hiding behind the couch, say, because, God only knows what's behind there. Although if you've been just cleaning the house to get rid of all of your chametz, then maybe it's clean back there, but hey. Okay, questions? Everybody's doing fine? Yeah. What is chametz? I've been using this term over and over. I've been talking about chametz, but I haven't actually explained what it is. Though it's often translated as leavened, it also means soured. So the word for vinegar, for example, and the word for sour in modern Hebrew are also built on this same root. The term specifically refers to one of 5 grain products: wheat, spelt, barley, oats, and rye, that have come into contact with their raw form with water for longer than 18 minutes. The reason for this, and I've given sermons on this, is that in the ancient days, you would take these and you would soak them. And if you soaked them, they would sprout. And if they sprouted, then they would be sweet. And if they became sweet, then you could make beer out of it. So that's actually the sort of physical root under this, or the reasoning behind why, if you soak them, they become fermented. Because back in the day, they didn't just have something like Red Star yeast that you could pour on this and make it bubble. And so what happens is that these products are not allowed during the time of the Passover holiday, and you are supposed to get rid of them in your household. And so that means that not only you're not supposed to have like a stash of noodles and bread and stuff in your pantry, you're supposed to get rid of all of those things, get them out of yours, but you're also supposed to go through your house and clean, like clean all of the little cracks and crevices where breadcrumbs might have gotten. So that means like the toaster is going to get a bit dismantled, or I mean, if you want to be serious, if you want to be seriously stringent about this, you can get really stringent about it. One of the things that people will do, for example, and I've done this in my life, there are times when I do it really stringently and times when I don't. That's actually normal. I've done things like taken all of the dishes in the household and koshered them by boiling them, or putting boiling water on them, and then also doing that on the countertops, and then covering the countertops, and then also vacuuming out all of the drawers. And then, like, and you can do all of this. You can go through the crevices in your kitchen tile with a toothbrush. I have done this. You can use the oven to, put it through its setting to clean the oven. I've done this. I've also done something much less stringent, and like it really varies where I'm at emotionally, physically, spiritually that year. In the pandemic year, for example, I did almost nothing, because in the first pandemic year, because it was like, there is no way I'm going to be able to do any of this. You know what I mean? So if you're thinking, oh my God, I need to be a good Jew, I'm going to need to do these things, go easy on yourself. Figure out what your level of observance is, work through what you want to do, and then make your decisions. Some other possibilities are, you can take painter's tape, the stuff that peels off easily, doesn't take the paint off, and cross off, certain pantry doors and just say, we're not using this one during this week, and then sell the contents to a non-Jewish family member or friend, and then buy them back at the end of the holiday. That's as kosher as scrubbing down your countertops. So that also works. Or you could just simply say, I'm just not going to eat this. But it's not possible to get rid of it in my home, because I have people in my home who are not Jewish and they're not going to do this. That's also fine. You figure out what you want to do. Sometimes though, people could, what happens is that there are a lot of products that are kosher for Passover, just for Passover, that if you want to be this kind of stringent observant, you'll replace them. So you'll go through and get rid of any of your open spices, for example. This could get expensive, and replace them with kosher for Passover spices. That's something people will do. Or you might notice during Passover that Coca-Cola products, there's kosher for Passover Coca-Cola products, and all the other soft drink products where they're not using corn syrup. The reason for that is that, as I told you, Ashkenazi and Sephardi have different practices in terms of what they do for holidays. And the Ashkenazis don't have what's called kitniot, which is rice, beans, corn, or peas as part of their of what they eat. They also, in addition to the wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye, they don't have those things. And so that makes them have to get rid of a lot more stuff in their pantry in order to be kosher for Passover. Does that make sense? I don't observe that, and the reason for that is because since I converted, my Hebrew name is Huva Leah Bat Avraham V'Sarah. Avraham V'Sarah, meaning Abraham and Sarah, are from the country of Ur originally, which is in fact in Sephardi land. So therefore I am Sephardi. That's what I decided. And so therefore I can eat kitniot. Ha. What's happened is actually in Israel is become, so many people are starting to like become mixed Ashkenazi and Sephardi, that Israeli practice is to just do Sephardi. And so that means that Israeli products that are marked kosher for Passover might have corn or rice or beans, in them. And so for folks who are Ashkenazi who observe kitniot, it's a problem. If you're somebody like me, you're like, yay. So, and there is in fact a group on Facebook called the Kitniot Liberation Front, kid you not, that argues that everyone should just, like give up the kitniot thing already. But if you go to somebody's house for Passover, you should find out, do they observe kitniot or not? That's one of the questions you need to ask. Making sense? Okay, I'm covering a lot of ground, so stop me if I'm not making sense, Okay. Wine. There's 4 glasses of wine as part of this Seder. First thing you need to know is that you do not have to drink 4 glasses of wine at a Seder if you do not want to. I mean, like if you want to drink 4 glasses of wine over 6 hours, have fun. But you don't have to have more than a swallow in order to qualify, having done the Seder. And it's perfectly fine to use juice. So if your liver is like, by all means, go for the juice. But the reason for the 4 glasses is that there's 4 promises that are given in the text. And so that's why we have the blessing and the wine for each of these. The first 2 take place in the first part of the Seder, and the second 2 take place after after the meal. And then there's actually a 5th cup of wine, which is Elijah's cup. And that one you're not supposed to drink from, although my dad found that out the wrong way. It's set out for Elijah, who's going to come and resolve all differences and all questions. We also, at the end of the Seder, invite Elijah in. We go and open a door and say, come on in, and then sing Eliyahu Hanavi, which means Elijah the prophet in Hebrew. The Eliyahu Hanavi. I told you there was a lot of singing. Eliyahu Hatishbi. We sing that toward the end of the Seder. So there's the wine. Part of the reason for all the wine is we actually believe that it brings gladness to the heart. And so then what happens is we have, a lot of our celebrations include wine. We have wine as part of Shabbat, when each Friday night we sanctify Shabbat with wine. Again, when we get to Purim, we'll drink a lot of wine there as a way to celebrate. And it's the idea that it makes us happy. Again, if wine does not make your heart or your liver happy, then don't do it. Have juice. It's fine. You can actually do this sort of blessing. You can use it in a sanctified way. Use any liquid that you can drink except water for this purpose. For the record, water isn't special enough, so that's why not water. And as a matter of fact, when we do the Friday night services, partly because I then need to lead the service, we normally have juice. I also have it as juice anyway, partly because I don't want to keep wine here in case there are kids getting into the kitchen and finding out what that mischief they can get into. It's better just to have them find juice boxes. So, but wine, big part of the holiday. This, by the way, the silver cup there is called a Kiddush cup. And it's a special cup. By the way, don't buy this particular kind because they will turn the wine sour and make it taste terrible. You want the ones that are lined, word to the wise. But it's normal and common to have a fancy cup that you use for these kinds of purposes as a way to sanctify and beautify the experience of the holiday. You also see there underneath what looks like silk with the embroidery on it with Hebrew letters. It says Pesach, which is the Hebrew name for Passover. What it is actually a special fancy cover for the matzahs for using in the Seder. Again, you buy these fancy things as a way of beautifying your observance of the holiday, but it is totally fine to use a regular wine cup. It is totally fine to use a regular napkin. You don't actually have to buy all the merch, basically. You don't have to buy the special stuff in order to do this right. It's perfectly fine. I feel like I need to explain that because otherwise you might apologize if you don't have all of the fancy things, you know. Don't worry about it. It's okay. Okay, other traditions. So as I said, Ashkenazi, German, Polish, Russian, Lithuanian, etc. Jews do not eat kidney oat, which are beans, peas, rice, and corn. Also, they will not eat lamb at the Seder as a memorial for the destroyed temple. However, the Sephardi Jews, the ones who are Spanish, Moroccan, Egyptian, and other places like that, they will, in contrast, intentionally eat lamb at the Seder as a memorial for the destroyed temple. So you can go either way on that one. Persian Jews, and this is super fun, and that's why I have this picture here, will hit each other with green onions during the song Dayenu to remember the Egyptian taskmasters. In my first congregation that I served as a student rabbi, there was in fact a Persian woman, and she brought this practice to that congregation, and it's one that actually we probably should in fact adopt here because it's super fun. Because as you can see, these little bundles of green onions look like whips. And so what happens is while you're singing die, die, hey new, die, die, hey new, you're actually smacking your neighbor with onions, which does not hurt and smells like onions and sort of livens things up at a moment when you're thinking, when do we eat? It's super fun, super fun. But so far I have not convinced the congregation to adopt this new practice. But this is that Israeli family. It's the same, this picture comes from that same series. And as you can see, they must have Sephardic roots because they have the green onions in little bundles ready to go. I think that's just adorable. Questions so far? Okay. Modern innovations. Feminist Jews will often include an orange on the Seder plate to make it clear that innovations such as the inclusion of women in ritual life are most welcome. There's a apocryphal story about how it came to be, that somebody would say that it was an objection that a woman belongs in the bima the way an orange belongs in the Seder plate. And so that's how the orange ended up on a Seder plate. But it's also the nice thing that orange, the other advantages of an orange is another very spring and happy thing. It's something that you can easily share because it breaks into segments and brings great fragrance. So it adds to the experience the way that having women involved adds to the experience. Similarly, many have also included a Miriam's cup. And a lot of times these cups are big ceramic cups that say Miriam on them. That's the most common one you'll find. I have seen our sisterhood gift shop sell them before. And they are actually filled with water, which you're like, wait a minute, you just told me a Kiddush cup can't have water. Well, this isn't a Kiddush cup, so that's why. The Miriam's cup is why water is Miriam was said to be the one who kept finding them water because they start grumbling about water immediately after she dies. And so this midrash, an explanation, grew up that Miriam was the source of the water. And so that's why Miriam and water and why a cup with water on the table. And she was important to the story in ways that, she had a different role than Moses or Aaron. And so it's worthy of commemoration in that regard. If you want to see what a Seder looks like in action, I have, and I'm going to put this on the, I'm going to put this in an email to you as well, so you can just click it instead of having to write it down. But we have a recording of our most recent congregational Seder. I know some of you were part of that, but as what I'm hoping is that if you would like to see how it unfolds and what it looks like, you can watch this. The nice thing about what we did with that Seder is we had put the text of the Seder up on the screen, similar to what we do when we do our services, our Friday night services, same kind of thing. We had the box with the slide. And so you can see the text and see me do it at the same time. I'm sitting at my living room table, or my dining room table, leading the Seder to the camera with my family off camera. And so, you can see what it looks like and hear some of the songs and get a sense of how it unfolds. Now, of course, that video recording is about 1 hour and 20 minutes long. So that's why I don't just play it for you now. And it's perfectly fine if you if you move forward on it. You don't have to hear me sing every verse. It's first, you'll get the idea, right? So, okay. So the next piece that we're moving into, yes, I see two hands. Go ahead. We'll start with Jacqueline Clay because you're on the top.
Oh, could you show that link again? As I was writing it
Oh,
down.
the link, I'll send it to you as an email. So
Oh.
I don't know how to go backwards on this. I realized earlier today, I'm going to have to figure that out. So, but yes, you will get the link. So you can just click it, and then it's a Boxcast recording. So you can move through it if you wish and
Thank
see
you.
what it looks like. And I'm also going to put up later, as we get to those classes, the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur service, some of those, you can see what those look like as well. So you'll get, I'll put links up for each of these things as I have links and other materials to support it. So that way you can see what I'm talking about. Okay. And Madison, you had a question.
Yeah, so I know you talked about the Haggadah at the beginning, but I also know, like, I've seen, like, at bookstores and stuff, different kinds of Haggadahs and different themes.
Yes.
And so I guess, like, how do you find your Haggadah, and like, what is the difference between them?
Oh, they vary quite a bit. So it's a very excellent question. Thank you for asking. The Haggadah has a basic structure, but that doesn't mean everybody does it. If you want to see what a traditional Haggadah looks like, just straight up, no frills, look at the one that comes with the Maxwell House coffee. That's a very traditional one with very few extras, and it's a little boring. But if you go to the bookstore and you see all these, what happens is you see a whole lot of different varieties, and they're aimed at different groups. One of my favorites is A Different Night, just simply because it's uses language that everybody can get a hold of. But I also really like the one that's called the Baskin Haggadah. It has really cool pictures in it, and it's structured well for leading a group. But what happens is that some of them are shortened to make it easier to get through and not to have it be a 6-hour ordeal. If you do every page of A Different Night, it will take you about 7.5 hours. So you kind of have to skip things. And the one that you saw in the picture when we first started is actually a really short, really bare bones one that's aimed at children. And how do you figure out which one's yours? Well, flipping through it. Also, how much does each book cost, and how many people are you going to have? So like, if you love one that's $100, you don't want to have to try to buy 24 copies of that. And such things exist. There's some beautiful ones out there. The little booklets, like a little $5 booklet might not have enough for your Seder. So these are the things that you balance. But the biggest issue is the best way to evaluate them is to open it up to the section that's called Magid. Magid means telling, and that section is where they tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and see how well they do it. Is it engaging? Do they have pictures? Is it fun? Is it interesting? Would you want to read this out loud? That's one of the best places to figure out, is this a good one or not? And the other thing that's funny about Haggadah is that there's actually two potential stories that could be told at Magid. One of them is the story that starts with Abraham. My father was a wandering Aramean, and the other starts with Moses. So you have your choice, and some of them have both stories in it. So it's not an easy choice to figure out which one you want. But every year I put up a little note about the ones that I've seen that I like, and I'll do that again this year. Sometime in about Purim time, about March, so that you have enough time to order it, get it. So.
Okay. And do people typically use the same, like, every year, or is it
mostly for cost reasons? Yeah, they tend to, because they don't want to have, like, if you're independently wealthy, by all means buy a whole new set of Haggadot every year. But I am not, so I tend to use the same one year to year. I have a nice little stack of the A Different Night. But the other thing is that there are people who will sometimes buy different Haggadot and then get people it requires a knowledgeable crowd to try to integrate the different ones. that I feel like I should say, don't try this at home. That's really hard to do, but it's not impossible. So,
Okay.
and there are people who make up their own. They like copy several different ones and make a little packet, and that. But if you do that, then we'll start talking about rabbinical school for you, because that's a rabbi thing.
Well, thank you.
Okay. So that actually is the presentation on Passover. What they have in this book is a lot more detailed, a lot more stuff. It walks through all of the different stages and pieces of the Seder. I just wanted to give you an overview of a few big important things, and that is matzah, wine, the Seder itself, that you're going to use a Haggadah, and that it's a big holiday, it's that it really matters. Like this is one of the core observances. Those are the big takeaways. What happens is that we also assigned as for this class, the counting of the Omer. That begins on the second night of Passover, and it continues until the holiday of Shavuot. Now, this is the thing that, the funny thing about the counting of the Omer was like a sheaf of grain is what it's counting. And you're counting the days until you bring it to the ancient temple. And theoretically, you should be able to count from the second day of Passover until the 49th day and be able to do it with a little blessing. It's not a big deal every night. I have never managed to do it. I'm just true story. Because you drop a day, and so what happens is that you'll hear it when you're in synagogue. Synagogues will remember to do it, but a lot of times people personally will drop it and not be able to. And so that's why there's actually such thing as Omer counters out there. They're little wheels or other kinds of things to help you remember, because it's hard to remember, and help you keep track because it's hard to keep track. There is actually a really great book written by one of my fellow rabbis, Karen Kadar, which is a series of meditations for the days of the Omer. And so sometime I'm going to have to get the book and read the meditations and actually count the Omer. I'm like, at some point it's going to happen. I'm going to get all 49 days in and do the blessing all 49 days. Haven't managed it yet. Anyway, there are 49 days. Traditionally, during this time, we observe a period of mourning to the Omer, meaning no parties until you hit the 36th day, which is called Lag BaOmer. Why the 36th day? There isn't a good answer. I mean, there is an answer. It isn't real. Does that make sense? The specific reason why the 36th day and why the mourning officially is that there had been a plague, and the plague lifted on the 36th day, and that's why mourning, and that's why the 36th day you have bonfires and then have a party. A more likely explanation is that you're waiting for the harvest to come in, and if you start eating and having parties early and before the harvest has come in, you could put your life in danger. You could eat your store grain, and you need to actually keep a ration on hand. And so more likely is that this is actually a recognition of the fact that living in Israel in ancient times was a hand-to-mouth subsistence experience. And so at the 36th day, you have a guarantee of a harvest. Is probably it. Plus also the ancient Romans like to do a bonfire on the 30s, around the time of the 36th day. So, and shoot arrows. So that's where bonfires and shoot arrows on Lag BaOmer comes from. It's a minor holiday. If you took random Jew in your office and said, what is Lag BaOmer? Random Jew is probably going to go, Lag Ba what? Right? This is not a well-known thing, although I am really in favor of recreating a celebration of it and having us do it, because I think bonfires are just plain awesome. And about that time of year, it's actually reasonable to be outside with a fire. So that, but that's what the counting of the Omer is. And that's also why we have these sheafs of grain and, like when speaking about the windows around the sanctuary, yes, I am going to use every one of these windows so that you know what they are. Why do we have windows with sheafs of grain in the sanctuary? Counting of the Omer, that's what it represents. Questions so far? Okay. Observances that occur during the counting of the Omer are Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. So Yom HaShoah was actually established by the government of Israel. So there are other days that could be observed related to the Holocaust. There's a traditional day for observance of catastrophe. There's a date that you could pick, the date of Kristallnacht. You could pick the date of the Warsaw Uprising, but it was the government of Israel that set the 27th of Nisan as the date. And that's just because, they had the power to do that. And so at this point in time, it's become the day, like in this book, he complains about it. And this book was written a little while ago. That's the only downside of it. It's a little out of date in that regard. 20 years have since gone by, and that's the day. What happens on that is usually we have a service in the synagogue that involves lighting candles. This is the most common way to observe it, lighting 6 memorial candles. And what we do is read different groups that were affected and how, and using survivor testimony. We also, at that time of year, routinely have a survivor, although at some point we won't have survivors anymore, but we have, so long as they're still available and still able to tell their story, we have a survivor come in and talk to our religious school kids, the older kids. At some point, the survivor will lose that survivor testimony, and we'll probably use recorded materials. There's a lot of recorded materials related to survivor stories. And one of the things that Strassfield wrestles with in the book is the question of theology and the Holocaust. That's something I'm happy to talk about. I mean, not happy to talk about the Holocaust, but that's something that appears in my book, and I can do a whole class on, but I'm just mentioning it in passing here. Okay. Questions, or should I move on? Okay. Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. There's the other window. This one is, you can see the flag of Israel and a dove. Israeli Independence Day is Yom Ha'atzmaut. And actually, oddly, he doesn't mention, he sort of mentions Yom HaZikaron. So there's actually 3 days that we could that are related to Israel that could be mentioned here. Yom HaZikaron is sort of their Memorial Day. And it's a big deal in Israel. What happened to me when I spent a year in Israel is they said, we're going to go to a local school for Yom HaZikaron and listen to their service. So you have an understanding of what Yom HaZikaron means to Israelis. We're like, okay, sure. And they're like, oh, and you should get there early because it's going to be standing room only. We're like, okay. So we get there an hour early to this school. And it turns out there is it is already standing room only, an hour early. And they give this service, they start a service, sort of a secular version of a memorial service. And they then read all of the names of everybody who had died from that school. And they read all of these names, and it's a long thing. Like, we're talking a 20-minute, like, imagine 100-year-old congregation does its entire yard site list. That's how long these names were, right? And I'm thinking, okay, and now we're done. And then they say, and now we will, that was that's who died in Yom Ha'atzmaut, the War of Independence. And here's now the list of those who died in the Suez. And here's the list of those who died and they literally, they went action by action, war by war. So we were there listening to names for more than an hour from this one high school in Jerusalem. That's the magnitude of loss that is related to Israeli Independence Day. And it's something that really needs to be acknowledged if you're going to understand Israel at all, is that how much that whole military challenge has been, and that how much each Israeli knows someone, more than a few, probably has several in their family, who were taken by one of these actions. So regardless how you feel, about Israel, regardless, this is something that's very deeply felt for Israelis. And Independence Day, though, itself, so they have the Yom HaZikaron, so they do Memorial Day and Independence Day basically back to back. And so what happens is you have this very deeply mourning country on Yom HaZikaron. And then in the next day, Yom HaAtzmaut, it is a major celebration, similar to 4th of July. Things like parades and picnics and barbecues and bopping each other over the head with these large plastic blue and white hammers that make squeaky noises, blow up toys, things like that. I kid you not. Silly string is a thing. And it's not taken for granted in the state of Israel that the state of Israel exists. I mean, American Jews can feel very conflicted about Israel and can feel very uncomfortable sometimes about the policies that Israel pursues. That happens. You will find folks. You'll find folks who are very, very pro-Israel and like anything it does is fine and is good. And you'll find some who are very, very ambivalent. With regard to Yom HaAtzmaut, though, and for Israelis, that's not so much the case. For the Palestinians who are Israeli, it is, because that's called the Nakba, the catastrophe. And so they have a different view of it entirely. But I wanted to mention all of this in context since he brought it up. In many congregations will observe in the United States Yom HaAtzmaut, usually with Israeli themed services, Israeli food or an Israeli themed day in the religious school or all the above. The tendency is to focus on the cultural aspects of Israel, because then you don't have to get into politics. Yom Yerushalayim is the day that in the 6-Day War in 1967, that Israeli soldiers were able to go and see the wall directly. So the pictures of the Israeli soldiers who break through enemy lines end up at the Western Wall and are just overwhelmed by being at the Western Wall. That's Yom HaYerushalayim. That's what it's commemorating. Interestingly, that's a big day still in Israel. It's because of the ambivalence about what happened after 1967, it's less of a big deal in the United States. You're less likely to see people making celebrations related to Yom HaYerushalayim. But for the record, if you're familiar with the song Jerusalem of Gold, can I sing it? I'm not sure I can sing it, but that's where that comes from. It's a Jerusalem Day celebration song. So, and gorgeous, everybody loves it. Questions? No questions? Well, next week we're going to go, oh yeah, I do have one. So next week we're going to do Shavuot. Yes. I can't hear you, you're muted. And I'm going to see if I can stop sharing.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Maybe a loaded question. Where should one start to learn about Israel and all of that?
Yeah.
It feels like it feels like it could be the first question or one of the first questions upon converting, at least among maybe with Jews too, but.
Yeah, it's really, one of the things it's a very good question. And I don't have an easy answer for it. I have some books. One of them, probably the best one to get started with would be perhaps The Zionist Ideas, which just kind of explain, but that's a huge book, but I'm recommending it to you because I know you're a reader. A simpler book, I have one that's called Israel, but I have to remember who wrote it. So I can get that to you in the email of books to read about Israel. In the process of conversion, and I can speak here as a convert myself, Israel is actually one of the most challenging aspects of the conversion process, because it's hard if you're coming in from the outside in to understand how visceral Israel is for Jews, American Jews as well as Israeli Jews. But how visceral it is to feel connected to Israel. And that is interesting. What happened, and probably the easiest way to explain it is this. We Jews have experienced trauma in a major way, not that long ago, and we're still raw from it in a very real way. and don't yet feel safe in the world. Just don't. And that includes America. And as a result, that's why you get Jews who say, why would you want to convert? Is that not feeling safe? And also why Jews feel like we have to have Israel. Israel matters. It must exist. And if you say anything that makes it sound like you think it might have been a bad idea, it gets very offensive very fast. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
It's historical trauma, and that trauma is real. And it's not in any way overblown or made up. That's a very real trauma, and we're just still wrong. And so that's part of the reason why it's such a hard issue to talk about it is that we're talking about two things at once. We're talking about a country in the Middle East that has policies that you may or may not agree with, and we are talking about a place that Jews are safe. And those are not the same thing. I mean, they are and they aren't, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
They're related to each other. But it's important to keep track of which conversation you're having, if that makes sense. So
Okay.
it's something to keep talking about and something to keep bringing up. Yeah. And it is definitely part of this whole experience. Okay, I need to find where I'm gonna just have to go through these. So you're gonna have to see these so I can get out of it. There we go. Okay. Because I don't know how to stop share otherwise. So forgive me, you can laugh at me. A year and a half after working with Zoom almost daily, pretty much daily, I still I don't know how to fix this. Oh, well. But so any other questions? I'm going to stop our recording if we don't, and then do some housekeeping after that.